So we've thought about the method of dealing with questions of canon. One of the things that one hears about a lot is the idea that there were Gospels that were lost or maybe suppressed by the church. And the idea is that these lost Gospels are of an equal level with the Gospels in the New Testament. And one to think about now is what the real picture is there. So we have the 27 books of the New Testament, but there are a whole lot of other books that have turned up, which we can have to think, why aren't those in the New Testament? There's a list of some of them. A fair number of them don't actually claim to be scriptures. The letter of Clement, Clement of Rome, Bishop of Rome, towards the end of the 1st century, writes a letter, but he doesn't think of it as scripture. So there's no reason for taking that to be scripture. We got same thing for the letter of Barnabas. That might be making a claim to being apostolic, or it might be some other Barnabas altogether. The Didache, discovered fairly recently, but doesn't seem to be claiming to be scripture. And the Proto-Evangelium of James seems to just be a romance. It's a historical novel written about 150-ish. Don't think anyone expected it seriously as scripture. So you can wipe those out straight away. But we're left with these Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Judas, things, a lot of them discovered at Nag Hammadi or Oxyrhynchus, fairly recent discoveries, and they tend to be sort of Gnostic works. So the Nag Hammadi thing, it's a town in Upper Egypt, fairly rural, not too far from the Nile. Farmer digging in the ground found a pot containing a whole load of very old books. These were sort of, well, there were one or two bits of Plato and so on, but a lot of them seem to be Gnostic scriptures. And they include 6 would-be Gospels. And one of those is the Gospel of Thomas. And I'll look at that one as a separate one. This one gets pulled out by a lot of people. Dominic Crossan talks about the 5 Gospels, includes the Gospel of Thomas among them. And it appears, if you read the critics, that they date it fairly early, and they say, there you are, it's equivalent to some of the other Gospels. Of course, they date those rather late as well. So what do we know about the Gospel of Thomas? Let's look at this one separately. There are 3 manuscripts of it available. There's an almost complete one from Nag Hammadi, the 1945 discovery, which is written in Coptic. And there are 2 very fragmentary copies, a couple of pages each, that discovered in Oxyrhynchus there in Greek. And we can put them together. You can see that the Greek ones are part of the text that you've got in Coptic as well. And what it is, it's a sayings gospel. Critics like that because they postulate the existence of a sayings gospel that's incorporated in Matthew and Luke. And so they said, good, that shows sayings gospels existed. But these are just sayings. There's no story behind it. There's no context for any of the sayings. It's just Jesus said, and then something that Jesus is supposed to have said. And the dates, the Nag Hammadi manuscript was written somewhere around 450 AD. The ones from Oxyrhynchus were written about 200 AD. Gives some idea of the date. It has to be written before 200 AD. By comparison, the oldest thing we've got from the Gospel of John, the oldest undisputed one's about 125 AD, but there are other ones somewhere around 150 these days. Only fragments, but they exist. Well, how are we going to decide whether the Gospel of Thomas is authentic or not? And for me, the first clue comes in the title. And now, I don't know how good your Coptic is. Mine's awful. I can't read anything much of it, but that bit's in Greek. And it's, according to the Gospel, according to John, the hidden one. And so Apocryphon, which means concealed, hidden, secret. You've got to ask the question, why does it use this word to describe the gospel? And there's 114 sayings of Jesus, and then there's what they call saying zero, which is a sort of introduction to the whole thing, which says these are the secret sayings that Jesus spoke. And the question again, why are they? What makes why are they described as secret? And that means no one knew this gospel, no one come across it for quite a long time after the time of Jesus. And then suddenly someone comes up with it, says, I've got another gospel. You've got 4 gospels. Here's number 5. Of course, people ask the question, why didn't we have it before? And he says, oh, well, these are the secret sayings. Jesus said public sayings, which you've got in your gospels, which were released immediately. These are secret ones, which we're only releasing now. So it's already telling you there's a gap between the writing of the official gospels, the gospels in the New Testament, and this extra gospel that they're producing, so that it's not known before the time that it's suddenly released. And it's actually got this word hidden written into the text, so they're having to explain it, and that's inside the text. It's not something that's just been stuck on afterwards. It's actually inside the text of the gospel. So it's not known until a century after the events, and that would mean it's not known until long after the last apostle had died. Now, another problem in it is saying number 5 in the Gospel of Thomas, and he quotes there, says, nothing hidden that will not be revealed. And that's a quotation from Luke 12 and verse 2. Your English translation probably doesn't look particularly like it, but in Greek it is very similar. And in fact, the Gospel of Thomas contains 22 direct quotations from the New Testament Gospels. It's got 13 statements, I call them multiple parallels, where they've taken 2 different sayings of Jesus and put them together to make one. And there's another 28 allusions where he says Jesus said that, and it refers to something Jesus said in the New Testament Gospel. So again, the Gospel of Thomas comes after the New Testament Gospels. What else have we got? Oh, the question of circumcision. So it talks about whether circumcision is important or not. Well, that's a discussion that Paul has. If you read the letters of Paul, there are various places where the question of whether sheep should be circumcised or not comes up. I just put the one which comes first in the New Testament order for the books. I suppose in Galatians is earlier in time, but it appears consistently in the letters of Paul. But Jesus doesn't discuss it. We know Jesus doesn't discuss it because when Paul discusses it, if he's got something from Jesus, he tends to put that in, says he's got it from Jesus. But he doesn't mention it, that there's anything from Jesus. So Jesus didn't discuss it. So we've got the Gospel of Thomas confusing an issue that's discussed by Paul with an issue that's discussed by Jesus. Something that only happened quite a long time after the event by someone who wasn't that familiar with the New Testament. There's very little context. It's very hard to look at the archaeology of the Gospel of Thomas because there's almost nothing there, but there is here. And what's happening here? We've got an anachronism because he talks about the story of the tribute penny, but he doesn't say a tribute penny, he says a gold coin. Now, the point, of course, is that it's a tax penny. And until the 2nd century, in fact, until about 150, the taxes were always collected in silver. They were collected in sesterces. They weren't collected in gold. In fact, he wasn't allowed to have them collected in gold because they hadn't fixed a rate of exchange between gold coins and silver coins. But in the 2nd century, they allowed the gold aureus to be used. And it looks as though the Gospel of Thomas is written sufficiently after that decision for it to become commonplace and for them to have forgotten that taxes only used to be collected in silver. So we've actually got one of the very few historical details in there, and Thomas gets it wrong. There's another reference to wineskins, which he gets wrong as well, being used to amphorae, which is what the Romans normally use, pottery vessels to hold wine in, rather than wineskins, which was a particularly Palestinian thing. There are one or two other points you can get in there. Sometimes when he quotes the Gospels, they're quoting a thing called a diatessaron that was produced by a chap called Tashan, referred to by Justin Martyr, refers to Tashan. Tashan is a disciple of Justin. And the first you hear of him is 152. The diatessaron wasn't written by them, but it seems to have been around by 170. And what he's done is he's put the four Gospels together and produced one story which contains extracts from all the Gospels. Occasionally he conflates two stories so that you've got part of the wording of one and part of the wording of another. And some of the citations of the Gospels in the Gospel of Thomas are using the wording of the diatessaron, which is not an exact copy of any of the actual Gospels. So that puts the Gospel of Thomas fairly late on. Another point is that if you look at the Greek copies of the Gospel of Thomas, then sometimes there are significant differences in the text between the Greek and the Coptic. I don't know whether how important that is. It could be just you've got a very bad translation into Coptic, but it could be that you've got text that is still developing as the time goes on, even as late as the 3rd or 4th century. So, summarize what we've got for the Gospel of Thomas. It contains a lot of words that are 2nd century words. If you look at linguistic fossils, it talks about there being a hidden gospel, for example, is the one I picked out, but there are other words that appear, the ideas of eons and so on, which are 2nd century ideas. The archaeology, it doesn't match the time of Jesus. There are no undesigned coincidences in it. It doesn't have any prophecies, let alone fulfilled ones. The sayings appear to have come from the real gospel, sometimes with slight changes to them. And he manages to confuse some of the sayings of Jesus with the sayings of Paul. Now, this doesn't create tremendous confidence in the Gospel of Thomas. It's talking about things that don't really fit in with it. So what we've got is evidence of late composition after the time of the apostles. Thomas was an apostle, so if it's after the time of the apostles, it's after the time of Thomas. So it contains a misstatement at the start to say it's written by someone who by this time was dead. It's definitely not all true, so we have to reject it. It's got no endorsement from an apostles anyway, no evidence of inspiration. We can give up on it. Another example, Gospel of Peter. So I think discovered a place called Achmim in Egypt. It's not part of the Nag Hammadi finds. And we haven't got all of it. We've only got 9 sides. Some people think that is complete. It's intended to be only that and plus a little tiny bit more. Some people think it might have been a very comprehensive one. And it's a rather fanciful account of the death and resurrection of Jesus. No one knows for definite it is the apostle of the Gospel of Peter. There's an apocryphal book referred to as the Gospel of Peter by church fathers, but they don't quote it. So we don't know it's definitely that, but this is written, everything's written from Peter's point of view. So they think maybe it's the same one. And there are 2 other manuscript fragments discovered at Oxyrhynchus, which are from other parts of the Gospel. They don't overlap this text, so we can't be sure they're even the same document, but they also seem to be from Peter's point of view. So they've called the whole lot the Gospel of Peter. It's Origen and Eusebius who refer to the Gospel of Peter, but don't quote from it. So just have a look at some of the things that are in it, and it's full of problematic statements. So when darkness comes over all the land at the 6th hour, that's noon, the people rush around saying it's sunset. Well, they would be quite foolish to do that because only a few minutes ago the sun had just been approaching noon. So they ought to have known that it wasn't sunset. So you've got this rather weird idea that the the onlookers don't know the time. Not even the Roman soldiers, who are probably quite good at telling the time, seem to have any idea what's going on. And later on in the same verse, they even think, oh, it must be night time because it's gone dark. Again, not likely. Verse 8, again, confusion of the way that the calendars work. The Roman calendar, days start at midnight, but people talked about the day starting at dawn. But Jewish days don't. They start in the evening. They start at 6 o'clock. So you've got the Sabbath drawing on in the morning. And you get it again there. But this time it's the Lord's Day drawing on. It's the same day, and identifies the Sabbath and the Lord's Day. Now, of course, the Sabbath isn't the Lord's Day. Sabbath, Saturday, the Lord's Day's Sunday. So there's discrepancy in the text there. And in any case, it's an anachronism. It wouldn't be called the Lord's Day yet. By the time the Revelation is written, Sunday's called the Lord's Day. But that's quite a bit later than the time of the crucifixion. So we've got an anachronism in there. They've forgotten how people would be counting time. There's a strange one. The Jewish authorities, the Jewish elders, are by the tomb. They're keeping guard. And that comes up later on. That's important to remember that. It comes up later on when you look at other parts of the Gospels. Then here's their description, actually, of the resurrection. These people, includes the Jewish authorities. It's verse 10, same verse. They see 3 men coming out of the tomb. See the stone blasted away from the tomb, and then 3 men come out. 2 of them are supporting one of them, and there's a cross following them. And it says the 2 of the head reached to the heaven, and the head of him was led by them over past the heavens. And it's a pretty odd description of the resurrection, shall we say. It seems that when they buried Jesus, they didn't just bury Jesus, but they buried the cross as well. The cross is actually in the tomb, which is quite odd, and it's coming out all on its own. And it actually talks. The response comes from the cross itself, which says, have you preached to those that sleep? And the cross says it's the mean going out there preaching. Again, it's very, very odd as a description of the resurrection. 1 or 2 other points that the chronology is all wrong. For example, it has the disciples going fishing, and has them going fishing on the last day of unleavened bread, which is 7 days after the first day of unleavened bread, which the Gospel of Peter puts on the day before the Passover, and that might be correct. But that would mean that 5 days after the resurrection, the disciples were in Galilee. They couldn't get there. They'd have had to run all the way. They could just about make it if they ran, but it's pretty unlikely they'd run and then have sufficient energy left to go fishing. So the chronology doesn't work. And in fact, working out the sequence of events in the crucifixion and resurrection is quite an effort. You can do it. Read my book on the subject if you want. It's available on Amazon. But you can put the sequence together, but the Gospel of Peter hasn't managed to do it. People who've been there at the time would naturally get it right. Working it out from the accounts you've got is difficult. The 4 Gospels we have, the events fit together beautifully when you take the time to put it together. But the Gospel of Peter just doesn't fit into that. And some of the problems are quite obvious. So the priests are at the tomb, so the guards don't have to go and tell them what happened. They would already know. And lots of other inconsistencies and discrepancies. So the Gospel of Peter simply doesn't fit together. It doesn't work. It doesn't have any sense of authenticity at all. 1 or 2 other odd ones. The Gospel of Barnabas, it's full of mistakes. The chap is talking about medieval Italy, not about 1st century Palestine. It's clearly written late medieval times. It's full of anachronisms. You can do things like you can get on a boat and sail from Jerusalem to Nazareth, for example. Nothing you can do in real life, but it happens in this book. So on the other one, Secret Mark, this is a fascinating one. It's produced by a scholar called Morton Smith, who claimed to have found it in a book. What he's found, he says that he's found a book in the Ent papers. There's a letter, for the copy of a letter written by an 18th century writer. He's copying a letter he's found that was written by Clement of Alexandria. And Clement of Alexandria is referring to something he found in a possible original of the Gospel of Mark, which exactly fits Morton Smith's rather weird theories of the Gospel of Mark. Trouble is that Morton Smith was unable to produce the actual documents themselves. He took some photographs, and if you look at them carefully, there's a stamp which says this belongs to Morton Smith. So it's probably not in the library of Mar Saba where he's supposed to have found it. It's probably in his own library, and no one has found that book since. So the Mar Saba people searched for it throughout their library and couldn't find it. So we have a non-existent document. Of course, Morton Smith, it might not be him who made the hoax. It might be the 18th century writer. Clement of Alexandria could be mistaken as well. So there are plenty of places, but it's been looked at by handwriting experts and say it's got what they call forger's tremor. It's written by someone who is writing in an unaccustomed handwriting style. So it looks as though someone has been trying to hoax Morton Smith, or maybe Morton Smith is hoaxing everybody else by trying to produce an 18th century writing style. So let's just conclude. The first thing is the chronology. The New Testament Gospels are guaranteed by apostles, so we don't have to worry about when they appear or their authenticity. They're guaranteed by the apostles. There's then a long gap when people write things, but they don't claim those things that they write are scripture. And the much later books that people are talking about as being potentially the lost Gospels or lost letters or even the lost Acts, they're much later. They aren't apostolic. If they claim to be apostolic, then they're telling lies. So we can reject those books. They're simply too late. They're not apostolic. And in fact, when you look at them, they usually contain a whole load of mistakes that don't let them fit in with the rest of the New Testament, or in fact with the first century at all. So they're full of errors and discrepancies. And if you go back to the diagram of how they were written, the New Testament documents are identified by the actual apostles. That's how we know they're scripture. The later books are not apostolic, so they've not got the imprimatur of the apostles behind them. And, well, they're just late. And whether they're accepted by the church or not, it doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. It's nothing to do with that. The important thing is that they were inspired when they were first written. Let's finish there.